So let's go ahead and welcome Zachary, your classmate.
Yeah, hello everybody else. This is much less stressful than I expected because nobody showed up. So this is huge. It's big for me. Hi, I'm Zachary Pines. This is basically what I wrote my paper on, and I'm going to do it in a presentation form. It's kind of cool. For those that know me for asking questions, you know that I'm very nihilistically inclined, specifically Mereological nihilism. I like it. I think it's very cool. It's kind of just like a funny idea. The idea that like we are going to deny the existence of everything just to get out of a loophole. Like this is good. Like the idea that there are no chairs, it's just particles arranged chairwise. That's funny. So I wanted to do something with this. But as I tried to make presentation ideas, it ended up just being me talking about nihilism and like recapping it. That's nothing. But there was one day where Carson and Dr. Watson were talking after class about ethics, and it kind of clicked that nihilism actually really struggles with ethics, at least naively, right? So I looked this up and I found a post that was specifically talking about is morality possible under mereological nihilism? And there's a really funny comment here, which is no, but there's fundamental physical symbols arranged morality-wise. So when I saw that, that's just a good response. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna cover this. I'm gonna see at least if I can do something here. So my presentation is trying to make mereological nihilism work with ethical frameworks. Now, quick recap of mereological nihilism, make sure we're all on the same page. Mereological nihilism is the idea that only mereological symbols exist. So whatever the fundamental particle of the universe is, that's all there is. There's no composite objects. It's just those particles arranged in the shape of stuff. And it's motivated by the idea of vagueness, right? Like we have vagueness there's vagueness in the way that we describe objects. And if we want to avoid that vagueness, one way to do it is just deny all objects together. But that's obviously a problem for ethics, right? Because when we look at ethics, at least Western ethics, it's kind of built on composite objects, right? People are generally in charge of morality. So when we think of when you're doing something wrong, it's typically you are doing something wrong. And more importantly, you're hurting someone else. If you're denying other people, you're kind of denying the whole premise that ethics is built upon. So there are ways around this. You can be an ethical nihilist. You think nothing matters. You can use fictionalism. There's also some Eastern ethics you can use to get out of this. I'll go into all of them later, but I'm going to just try to stick to a more traditional ethic. Can we make it work under nihilism? So my first big thing that I found is there's a guy named David Mitchell Cornell, and he has an idea that basically solves the emergence problem under nihilism. And it's the idea that you can have higher order properties without having higher order objects. That's a little bit complicated. So if you imagine, have you ever seen chainmail before? Chainmail armor? It moves kind of weirdly. It's like these hard pieces of metal linked together. When you move it, it's pretty wavy. So you would say, hey, this sheet of chainmail is really wavy. And that's true. But you'd be kind of crazy for saying any of the individual pieces of metal are wavy. It's solid metal. All of it's solid. But together, they instantiate the idea of waviness. And this is what he's going to go into. You can have higher order ideas that are not true for any of the lower level objects that instantiate them. So we go into this. This is called irreducibly collective instantiation. The idea is that you have a property, and it's getting instantiated by a lot of small things, but that no single instance of those small things instantiates the bigger overall thing. Now, why does this matter for ethics? Well, an interesting thing that this basically lets us do is talk about pain and suffering and important ethical ideals under nihilism, right? So one thing that he's talking about in the paper is the idea of like a cat suffering. So for me, I would say, hey, look, that cat is in pain. But the nihilist would kind of reject that and say, hey, there's no cat, therefore nothing's feeling pain. And what David Cornell basically is, or Mitchell basically saying, Cornell's saying that even though we're not going to be ontologically committed to the cat, we can say that this group of particles arranged catwise is still instantiating pain, right? There is still that higher order ideal that is being instantiated by these things that we're not going to name it. We're not going to say it's a cat, but we're going to say that pain and suffering are happening. Well, this seems like we kind of just solved ethics, right? I mean, we did it. We're going to try to reduce pain and suffering because those are selectively instantiated properties. So even though we're a nihilist, a mereological nihilist, we have found a way to make ethics work. And we're building towards an idea like utilitarianism, where I'm going to hit that really quick. Utilitarianism basically says that the moral option, the most moral thing that you can do, is whatever reduces suffering by and large, right? So if we have suffering, we kind of got with utilitarianism. Does this work? It kind of works, right? But there's a few things. First of all, consciousness is a little bit different. Trying to instantiate it as one of these objects is much more difficult because it's not a simple property, right? Like consciousness is a much bigger deal. But more importantly, why does the nihilist care, right? Because we brought up that we can maybe theoretically, using this, a nihilist could be a utilitarian. But like, would they? Probably not. I mean, you're choosing to be a mereological nihilist. You're going to choose the least ontological commitment. And voluntarily adding this doesn't seem like it makes much sense for anyone that's like any practical reason. So maybe we've said that a nihilist could be utilitarian. I don't think we've done enough. I don't think we've actually proven anything. So at this point, I thought I was going to talk to an actual nihilist. So this is Yashin Voss. They are a grad student who is an actual nihilist. Now, to be fair, they're also an ethical nihilist, meaning they actually don't think that anything has any meaning, or they don't have to do anything ethically. Very interesting. It was a crazy conversation because that's not something I've ever really thought about, but it was cool. They sent me a very lovely email, which is really funny because you wouldn't expect an ethical nihilist to be super charming in their email. But there were two things that at this point they brought up, because I was going to try to use some alternate outs to get out of this, because at this point I hadn't actually proven anything. So I was like, hey, maybe I could use fictionalism, maybe I could use Eastern ethics. And they kind of shut that down by saying that, unfortunately, nihilism actually works really well with them, and that's like an established fact. I'm going to talk about fictionalism really quick. Fictionalism is the idea that even if nihilism, or even if not ethical nihilism is true, we can kind of just pretend that other ethics work, just for the sake of making society happen, right? Let me say that right here. We should act like morality does exist for practical social reasons. And tragically, this is something that more nihilists, they actually really like. This is an easy out for saying, hey, I know that I'm not going to say that it exists, but we all know it exists. Let's do it for societal sake. Okay, that idea's out. Buddhism is a little bit of a harder idea to get rid of, but I also ended up tossing it for a pretty simple reason, right? So Buddhism says that general moral wrongdoing comes from desire, right? So when you desire things, that is generally what is less moral, and you're also trying to reduce human desire, right? And the problem that I found is that a nihilist can pretty easily say that they're doing this because they're denying that anything exists. You can't desire something that isn't real. You can't desire nothing. On top of that, Eastern ethics as a whole generally try to say that you should try to reduce certain things. And that is like the more moral choice. Try to reduce your commitment, try to become one with the universe, etc. And mereological nihilism actually works really well with this framework. So if we're trying to prove that an Eastern ethic works with nihilism, you don't have to do much. It's too easy again. So I ended up scrapping this. And this is when I started talking to the professor, and I was like, hey, I need some way to make the mereological nihilist care about the fact that pain and suffering might exist. So this is when we're going to add another thing. Panpsychism. Let's go. So panpsychism says that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality. And this is actually crazier than I initially thought, because I thought that it was saying that consciousness, like in humans, is fundamental. No, it's like there's like a fundamental consciousness particle. So a true diehard panpsychist would say that, protons, neutrons, and electrons, they all have something like called a rudimentary consciousness. It's not as strong as obviously the one that's collectively instantiated when we have humans, but everything has a consciousness. And what's notable here is that this does not contradict the irreducibly collective instantiation. In fact, it actually works really well with it. Right? We're taking these ideas that we're taking multiple particles, putting them together, we get a higher order idea. That higher order idea is like a different level of consciousness. So if you are a nihilist and you're a panpsychist, we kind of have two things that work together and will make you care about ethics. So the argument overview is if someone is a mereological nihilist and they're happy with irreducibly collective instantiation, and they're also a panpsychist. And okay, I had to smuggle one more thing in here. They also have to admit that suffering is a bad thing. I couldn't get rid of it, but at the same time, if you're not a nihilist, you can also just say that suffering is not a bad thing, and then you don't need to do any ethics. So you have to bring one thing in. I chose utilitarianism because it has the least smuggling. I think that suffering is bad. We can be okay with that one. If you want to make a different ethic, you have to smuggle a little bit more stuff in. If you accept all four of those, then despite the fact that you are a mereological nihilist, you should not, or you cannot, or being an ethical nihilist is inconsistent with your other worldviews. Let's go over how that works. Premise one, only simples exist. You're a nihilist, we get this. Number two, groups of simples can collectively instantiate properties such as pain, suffering, pleasure. They're all able to be one level abstracted without having an object they're attached to. Number three, consciousness is a fundamental property. We are also panpsychist. And number four, suffering is intrinsically bad. Here's the order that I basically put them in. Suffering is a real instantiated property that exists in the world. We know this because we have the consciousness, we can see how it's affecting it. Next, we know that its instantiation doesn't depend on the composite objects. We don't need people to have this suffering being a thing because of the irreducibly collective. Third, reducing suffering is morally relevant. Even within nihilism, this is kind of the one that we're doing. And that actually just is the argument. At that point, we have utilitarianism basically created under nihilism. And this is a little bit of a stupid thing that I'm doing here. There's not much meaning we're getting out of this, but it's fun. So I chose to do this. Anyway, there's a few counters that actually matter here. The first one is, if you are a nihilist who's not going to take panpsychism, are you unethical? Now, I don't think it's my place to put ethics onto people that are happy with their own ethics. If you're an ethical nihilist and you are living your best life, that is good for you. All I'm saying is that if you have those other two, then it is counter to the things you believe. If you're going to add panpsychism in, then you can't continue to be an ethical nihilist and have it all work together. But I'm not going to, it's not my place. Next one, is this person that is a panpsychist still a mereological nihilist? That's the one that's a little more difficult. I would argue the answer is yes. Looking into the definitions of mereological nihilism, there are a few of them, but generally they all tend to agree that the only thing you really need is to not believe in higher order objects. So the idea of these higher order things that affect objects are not, it's not inherently contradictory, and therefore I'm going to say that they are yes. Third one is, can a nihilist bite the bullet? I actually don't think that at any point here they can just say, no, you're wrong. Now, they can obviously disagree with the suffering part. They can say that human suffering, who cares about people suffering, right? Not much I can do about that. If you want to do that to avoid my ethics, that's fine. But outside of that, I believe that all three of those come together to create a basically irrefutable, if you believe those three things, then you are a nihilist who is also not an ethical nihilist, which is interesting, right? Because it's contrary to what is obvious, and most people would not think utilitarianism works under nihilism. That's my presentation. It's interesting. It's not saying the most, but it is kind of a cool idea that it's even possible. Thank you.
So go ahead and moderate some Q&A if you're okay with it. Yeah. So yes, questions or thoughts that come up. Potential challenges. Yeah.
Yes, I was still kind of a little bit slow, I think, to fully understand, but it seemed like the problem that the nihilist would have is the problem of like motivation, moral motivation.
Yeah.
So you're saying that once they accept panpsychism, then that they should have a moral motivation because they're accepting that suffering and pain can be a higher level.
So the argument that I'm making is that before you add panpsychism, the fact that suffering is a thing that exists in the world doesn't intrinsically matter to you because it's not affecting anything, right? If you're still denying the fact that people are real, the suffering isn't actually attached to anything. It's attached to the collection of particles. And while it's cool that we can instantiate suffering, it's not targeting anything we care about. But the second you add panpsychism in, there's now a consciousness that we agree exists. And suffering affects consciousness, right? So when we say, well, now it's not that the suffering is affecting you, it's that it's affecting the consciousness within you, and that consciousness matters. Now we have a target for the suffering, and we want to reduce that to reduce the suffering that consciousness feels as a whole. So it's not about you, not about the particles that make you up, but the consciousness within those particles. Kind of. Again, it's a little bit loosey here because I don't think any nihilist is actually going to be a panpsychist. Mm-hmm. I looked. There's a guy named, oh boy, it was David something. You're going to know immediately if I can look it up. I was halfway there. Who was the hard theory of something.
You mean David Chalmers.
David Chalmers, thank you. I am blanking on his name, but yes. Yeah. Who is not a panpsychist himself, but has said that panpsychism could be the way to do it. And he's also not a nihilist, but is like open to nihilist ideals. He was the closest I could find to somebody that was willing to accept both. And even he is not saying either, but I mean, I tried. It's interesting. It's something there, but because there's no one I can talk to that agrees with both of them, it's not easy to get a good answer on what they would actually think in real life.
No, I think that answered my question. Thank you.
Are you a mereological nihilist or consider yourself to be?
So I am not as strong a nihilist as Yashin, who I talked to, who is like really bought in on this whole thing. I like to think of myself as somebody that I'll take nihilism, but I will use other frameworks a lot of the time in the way that fictionalism does. So I will use, for example, Neo-Aristotelianism as my framework of choice when it comes to like being practical. But underlying all of that, I'm saying that we're using these frameworks more as like a window into being useful in the real world not what's actually happening. So like we can talk about these things as if they're real, and I will treat them as if they're real for the sake of doing ethics. I'll treat them as if they're real for all of that. But underlying all of it, it really is just particles. And that partially comes from the fact that I don't find consciousness very special. I think that ultimately this is just like the meat computer in our brains kind of just doing math, and we end up with something that seems like consciousness. And partly because I don't like the idea that objects move through time. I think it just kind of looks like slices, and then everything happens, and then we're kind of just experiencing it. So I'm most aligned with neurological nihilism, but I don't think that I take it to the extreme. And I'm not really bought in on it like some other nihilists are.
And in terms of like ethical nihilism,
Oh, definitely not. No,
Yeah.
I'm not.
so you're just trying to like make kind of Mereological
This is
nihilism
more of a thought experiment. This is not what I believe. I'm also definitely not a panpsychist. I'm like as far away as you can get, actually. But it's cool, so I want to talk about it because it's interesting.
I'll give you a question. So one of your prophecies in your construction of things was that suffering is intrinsically bad. And I'm wondering if you could weaken that but still maintain the rest of your What if you said suffering is intrinsically bad? We just say suffering is regularly correlated.
It's worse than the alternative.
It's just a correlation. So suffering and madness are really closely correlated. So
Interesting.
if you have evidence of suffering, that's good evidence that there's probably bad.
Okay, let me think really quick. So the answer is probably, but I don't want to give someone enough wiggle room to escape from my mind, right? Because I think that when you have these two things are pretty closely correlated, what you allow someone to do is to say, look, suffering generally seems like it's correlated with bad, but any act of suffering, we can't prove that it's bad. So I don't need to really do anything to reduce suffering because who knows if that would actually maybe that makes things worse. So the reason I said intrinsically bad is because I didn't want anyone to escape, but I kind of like the idea that they're strongly correlated enough that the average suffering is bad, therefore you have to still treat it as serious. I think the answer is that because this is a ridiculous argument, probably, I also don't want to give more weakness to this weak argument than I have to. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Zach, and